Picture this scene, if you will. It's 847 years after Christ, somewhere in what we'd call Norway today, and you're watching a young man make what might be the worst presentation in Viking history. Ragnar Thorson stands before the Thing assembly. Imagine a town hall meeting, but everyone's armed, and most people are looking for an excuse to start a fight, holding pieces of birch bark covered in charcoal scratches that he insists represent the future of Viking architecture. The warriors are laughing, not chuckling, not smirking, roaring with the kind of laughter that echoes off the surrounding hills and probably scares away wildlife for miles. Because what Ragnar is showing them isn't a design for a proper Viking longhouse, the kind their fathers built and their fathers' fathers built before them. No, this bastard son of Bjorn Ironside is sketching something that looks more like a fortress than a home, complete with what appear to be walls within walls, and bridges that somehow disappear when enemies approach. Now, when I say bastard son, I mean it literally. In Viking society, that marking followed you everywhere. Ragnar carried his father's strength. Bjorn Ironside was legendary for his raids into the Mediterranean, but not his name, not his inheritance, and certainly not his respect. His mother's low birth meant that no matter what Ragnar accomplished, he'd always be seen as something lesser, something not quite legitimate in the eyes of the traditional power structure. But here's what made Ragnar different, what set him apart from every other ambitious young Viking trying to make his mark through violence and conquest. Where other warriors saw glory in burning enemy halls, Ragnar saw only devastating waste. Think about the economics of destruction for a moment. Each longhouse that went up in flames represented 3 full years of back-breaking labor, felling massive trees, shaping timber with primitive tools, assembling the complex framework that kept these structures standing through brutal Scandinavian winters. And for what? So that everything could be destroyed in a matter of minutes when the next raiding party showed up with torches? Ragnar had spent his childhood studying something most Vikings took for granted, how these buildings actually worked, or more accurately, how they failed. While other boys dreamed of glory in battle, he watched smoke dance through the hall's heights during winter gatherings, noticed how the coldest spots were always where the grandmothers sat on the outer benches, coughing through the long dark months. He saw how traditional designs didn't just fail to protect against enemies, they killed inhabitants slowly, through cold and smoke and the accumulated misery of badly planned spaces. The mockery from the Thing assembly should have been the end of it. In most stories, our hero would have slunk away to lick his wounds and maybe try a more conventional path to success. But history, real history, has a way of providing the most dramatically perfect timing. While Ragnar stood there being laughed at for his revolutionary ideas about defensive architecture, Hakon the Burned was riding hard toward Ragnar's childhood home with a warband of 30 seasoned raiders. Hakon had earned his nickname through his particular enthusiasm for arson. The man genuinely loved watching buildings burn, took artistic pride in how thoroughly he could reduce a settlement to ash and ember. The cruel irony couldn't have been scripted better by the gods themselves. As the Thing assembly debated the value of Ragnar's fireproof designs, Hakon was already lighting the torches that would transform those theoretical discussions into urgent, personal reality. When news arrived of the attack, carried by a half-dead messenger whose horse had collapsed just outside the assembly grounds, the laughter died instantly. But the tragedy was already complete. By the time anyone could respond, Ragnar's home, the place where he'd learned to observe building failures, where his grandmother had taught him that walls should serve the people inside them, not just impress the people outside them, had been reduced to a smoking ruin. Picture Ragnar kneeling in those ashes, holding his grandmother's blackened arm, ring the only thing that survived the fire intact. The woman who'd raised him, who'd encouraged his strange fascination with construction and design, was gone. The home that had shaped his understanding of how buildings should work was nothing but glowing embers and bitter smoke. This is where most revenge stories begin, isn't it? The hero swears vengeance, gathers allies, hunts down the villain for a final confrontation. But Ragnar's oath, sworn there in the ruins with his grandmother's arm ring pressed against his palm, was something entirely different. He promised to build a hall that no flame could consume, no axe could breach, no enemy could destroy, through conventional means. The The journey that followed reads like something from a fantasy novel, except every stop makes perfect historical sense. Ragnar didn't head straight home to start building. Instead, he traveled, and he learned, and he collected techniques that no Viking had ever thought to combine before. His first destination was the Finnish territories, where builders had mastered something Vikings barely understood: thermal mass. These weren't just crude shelters, but sophisticated structures designed around saunas and heating systems that maintained warmth through the harshest winters. Ragnar spent months learning how stone and clay could store heat, how proper ventilation could move warm air without losing it to the outside. From there, Byzantine traders introduced him to concepts that must have seemed like magic: Greek fire that burned on water, architectural principles borrowed from Roman engineering, the idea that walls could be built not just to stand up, but to actively resist specific types of attack. These weren't just building techniques, they were military technologies disguised as construction methods. But the real breakthrough came in Trondheim, at the shipyards where master craftsmen built the dragon ships that carried Viking raiders across known oceans and beyond. Ragnar watched them working with overlapping planks, creating hulls that could flex with massive waves without breaking apart. The principle was elegantly simple. Instead of trying to be absolutely rigid, these ships bent just enough to survive forces that would shatter conventional construction. Standing there in the shipyard, watching craftsmen shape planks that would outlast storms and battles and years of hard use, Ragnar finally understood how to solve the problem that had haunted him since childhood. Walls didn't have to be immovable to be impregnable. They could bend, they could flex, they could absorb impacts that would destroy traditional construction if they were built using principles borrowed from the most successful military technology of the age. The arm ring was still warm in his hand when he sketched his first real design, the one that would change everything, because now he knew exactly how to build something that had never existed before, a hall that could protect its people not through size or intimidation, but through revolutionary engineering that turned the building itself into the ultimate defensive weapon. The question was whether anyone would be crazy enough to help him build it. 4 years. That's how long it took Ragnar to transform from a laughed-at dreamer into the most sought-after builder in the northern kingdoms. By spring of 851, he stood at the edge of a strategic fjord junction where 3 major trade routes converged, commanding an alliance that would have seemed impossible just a few seasons earlier. Let me paint you a picture of what this site looked like. Imagine standing where the modern city of Bergen might one day rise. But instead of medieval buildings, you're looking at raw wilderness, punctuated by the kind of natural harbour that made Viking merchants salivate. Ships from as far south as the Frankish kingdoms and as far east as the Rus territories regularly stopped here to trade, restock, and avoid the pirates that plagued less protected waters. Control this junction, and you controlled a fortune in trade revenues. But Ragnar wasn't thinking like a typical Viking entrepreneur. Where others saw an opportunity to build a traditional trading post, maybe a decent longhouse, some storage buildings, a dock for collecting harbour fees, he envisioned something that had never existed, a permanently defensible commercial centre that could protect not just goods and gold, but entire communities through the worst that the Viking age could throw at them. His first major ally was Astrid the Wise, and calling her simply a vulva, a Norse sorceress, doesn't begin to capture her influence. This woman commanded respect from jarls who wouldn't normally listen to female counsel because her prophecies had an uncanny habit of proving accurate. When Astrid began speaking of stone-hearted halls that would stand when wooden kings fell, believers flocked to hear more. She didn't just endorse Ragnar's vision, she gave it the kind of divine legitimacy that could turn skeptics into investors. Then there was Eric Goldcounter, whose nickname tells you everything about his priorities. This merchant had spent decades calculating the true cost of Viking raiding culture, not just the immediate profits from successful raids, but the long-term losses from constant insecurity. Eric had run the numbers, and they were devastating. A single warehouse burned by raiders represented 5 years of accumulated trading profits. A merchant ship sunk by pirates meant 20 successful voyages just to break even. But one impregnable fortress that could guarantee safe storage and secure trading? That was an investment that would pay dividends for generations. The construction site became something unprecedented in Viking Age Scandinavia, a multicultural workshop where innovation mattered more than ancestry. Ragnar paid skilled thralls not with beatings and bread, but with freedom contracts. Work 3 seasons on the Iron Hall project, master one of the new construction techniques, and walk away as a free craftsman with skills that would make you wealthy anywhere in the northern kingdoms. He negotiated bulk iron purchases from Frankish traders who were amazed to find a Viking more interested in construction materials than stolen church silver. Celtic stonemasons, fleeing raids in Ireland, found themselves welcomed as technical consultants rather than enslaved as labourers. Even outcast craftsmen, the ones whose radical ideas had gotten them exiled from traditional guilds, discovered that Ragnar would pay premium wages for techniques that conventional builders dismissed as impossible. And slowly, incredibly, the impossible began to rise from the rocky ground. The revolutionary design emerged, plank by carefully fitted plank. First came the double walls, not the simple double-thickness construction you might expect, but something far more sophisticated. The outer wall bore the brunt of weather and attacks, while the inner wall created a living space that remained comfortable regardless of external conditions. Between them, crushed stone fill provided not just insulation, but thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through cold northern nights. Hidden within the massive corner posts, iron reinforcements created a skeleton stronger than anything built in wood alone. These weren't just decorative metal fittings, but carefully calculated structural elements that distributed weight and stress in ways that let the building flex under extreme loads without collapsing. But the most ingenious innovation was the retractable bridge system. Picture approaching the Iron Hall as a friendly trader on a calm summer day. Wide, welcoming walkways stretched across defensive ditches, allowing easy access for heavily loaded carts and pack animals. But trigger the hidden counterweight mechanisms, and a child could operate them once they knew the secret, and those same walkways vanished in heartbeats, leaving enemies facing deadly gaps with no way to bring siege equipment close to the walls. The breathing walls represented Ragnar's most sophisticated adaptation of shipbuilding techniques to defensive architecture. Overlapping planks mounted on pivot systems could shift and flex under the impact of battering rams, absorbing and deflecting force instead of simply resisting it. Hidden within the wall structure, ceramic pipes could channel defensive fires, boiling oil, heated sand, burning pitch directly to where attackers were concentrating their efforts. When Hakon the Burned arrived with 50 raiders in late summer, believing he'd found easy plunder at a half-completed construction site, he discovered just how thoroughly Ragnar had learned from their previous encounter. The attack began like dozens of similar raids Hakon had led before. His warriors expected to find frightened workers fleeing toward the woods, maybe a few guards putting up token resistance before the real looting began. Instead, they found themselves facing a construction site that fought back like a living thing. Workers who should have been running for their lives instead fought from incomplete scaffolding with the desperation of people defending their life's work. Ragnar's defensive channels, still being tested and refined, funneled attackers into carefully planned killing zones where concentrated missile fire turned individual warriors into pincushions. The battle lasted only hours, but it cost Hakon 7 of his best fighters, and nearly cost him his life when a section of incomplete wall suddenly revealed hidden archer positions. When his surviving raiders finally retreated, they carried stories that would spread throughout the northern kingdoms, stories of a building site that had defeated seasoned warriors, of walls that seemed to think and respond to attack. The victory proved Ragnar's concept beyond any theoretical argument. Even half-finished, even still under construction, his revolutionary design protected its inhabitants better than the strongest traditional longhouse. Word spread like wildfire through trading networks that connected Iceland to Constantinople. Someone had figured out how to build something genuinely new, something that changed the fundamental equations of power and defense that had governed Viking society for generations. But as Ragnar stood among the scattered equipment of defeated raiders, watching smoke rise from his still incomplete walls, he knew this was only the beginning. Hakon the Burned was small time, a local problem with limited resources and conventional thinking. The real test would come when established powers, jarls with hundreds of warriors and decades of military experience, decided that this upstart bastard and his revolutionary fortress represented a threat that needed to be eliminated before it could inspire others to similar ambitions. The Iron Hall would either prove itself against that greater test, or it would become the most elaborate tomb ever built in the Viking world. By 856, the completed Iron Hall had become something that shouldn't have existed in the Viking world, a genuinely multicultural community where survival trumped traditional social hierarchies. 300 people now lived within its protective embrace, and their daily lives represented a revolution as significant as the building's defensive innovations. Walk through the Iron Hall on any given morning, and you'd witness scenes that would have been unthinkable in a conventional Viking settlement. Separate family chambers maintained privacy while still connecting to communal spaces, a concept borrowed from Byzantine urban planning that solved the age-old problem of housing multiple generations under one roof, without constant conflict. The great central hearth still hosted evening gatherings where stories were told and alliances forged, but now children could retreat to protected courtyards when they tired of adult politics, and apprentices could learn specialized crafts in workshop spaces designed with southern-facing windows that maximized precious daylight hours. Astrid the Wise had established a healing room that drew wounded travelers from hundreds of miles away. But this wasn't just a place to treat injuries. It featured an innovative interior garden where medicinal herbs grew year-round, protected from harsh weather by the building's sophisticated heating system. The thermal mass that made the walls impregnable also created microclimates that allowed delicate plants to thrive through brutal Scandinavian winters. The economic implications were staggering. Craftsmen could work through seasons that normally brought productivity to a halt. Traders could store goods safely for months at a time, waiting for optimal market conditions instead of selling immediately to avoid theft. Farmers fleeing less protected settlements brought livestock and seed grain, knowing their families would survive whatever conflicts raged in the surrounding territories. But success breeds envy, and revolutionary change threatens established power structures in ways that go far beyond simple competition. The threat arrived in late autumn as three of the region's most powerful jarls, Grimr, Shipbreaker, Magnus the Proud, and Olaf Wheatburner massed 500 warriors to destroy what they called a coward's castle that undermined the very foundations of Viking culture. Think about their position for a moment. These men had built their power on the Weka, traditional Viking equation: strength through raiding, security through intimidation, wealth through conquest. Ragnar's Iron Hall represented a completely different model: prosperity through commerce, security through engineering, power through community cooperation. If this alternative proved viable, it wouldn't just compete with their methods, it would expose those methods as unnecessarily destructive and ultimately self-defeating. The siege that followed became the stuff of legends, though like most legendary events, the reality was far more complex and far more interesting than the simplified stories that survived in later sagas. Day 1 shattered the attackers' confidence before the real fighting even began. Grimr Shipbreaker, whose nickname came from his expertise in destroying enemy vessels, expected to find conventional wooden walls that his men could hack apart with axes and burn with torches. Instead, arrows bounced off angled surfaces designed to deflect projectiles, while warriors attempting to scale the walls simply vanished into concealed pit traps that opened beneath their weight. Day 3 brought the horror that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Ragnar had spent years perfecting a defensive mixture of boiling pine resin and seal fat that created flames water couldn't extinguish. When attackers concentrated their assault on what appeared to be a weak point in the eastern wall, hidden channels released this liquid fire, creating a sticky inferno that clung to armor and flesh alike. The screams echoed across the fjord for hours. But Day 5 revealed Ragnar's true masterstroke, the mechanism that transformed the Iron Hall from an impressive fortress into something that seemed to defy the laws of nature itself. The entire central hall, the massive structure that housed the community's heart, could rise on enormous counterweights, elevating defenders to commanding heights while trapping attackers in a sunken killing field, where concentrated fire from multiple directions made survival virtually impossible. The genius wasn't just in the engineering, though. That was sophisticated enough to impress modern architects, but in the psychological impact. Imagine being a veteran warrior, confident in your understanding of how buildings work and how sieges progress, only to watch the ground itself seem to shift beneath your feet as walls rose into the sky, and safe positions became death traps in a matter of moments. Women and children operated these defensive mechanisms with practiced precision that spoke to months of careful training. 12-year-old Thorun Ragnarsdottir commanded the bridge systems from a protected control room, her small fingers flying over the counterweight releases with the expertise of a master craftsman. Her mother Astrid coordinated archer positions from concealed galleries that provided clear fields of fire while remaining virtually invisible to attackers below. This wasn't a community of helpless civilians protected by a warrior elite. It was an entire population that fought as a single, coordinated organism, with the building itself serving as both weapon and shield. When enemies finally breached the outer defenses on the seventh night, exhausted and decimated after a week of constant failure and mounting casualties, they found not cowering victims but defenders who had used every moment of the siege to prepare for exactly this eventuality. Hidden passages allowed rapid redeployment of fighters, while pre-positioned supplies meant that the Iron Hall's defenders were actually better rested and better equipped than the besiegers who had spent a week camping in increasingly harsh weather. The final assault collapsed not through dramatic heroics, but through simple arithmetic. Magnus the Proud had begun the siege with 500 warriors. By dawn of the 8th day, barely 200 remained combat effective, and those were demoralized men who had watched their supposedly unstoppable force break apart against innovations they couldn't understand or counter. When the surviving Jarls finally called for withdrawal, they left behind more than just their dead. They carried stories that would spread throughout the Viking world, tales of a building that seemed alive with defensive purpose, of walls that moved and floors that shifted, of a community that had discovered how to make architecture itself into the ultimate military technology. The siege's end marked more than just a tactical victory. It proved that Ragnar's vision could work not just in theory, but against the worst opposition the traditional Viking world could muster. The Iron Hall had faced the concentrated might of established power and emerged not just intact, but stronger. Its defensive systems tested and proven under the most extreme conditions imaginable. But victory, as Ragnar would soon discover, could be just as dangerous as defeat, especially when that victory challenged the fundamental assumptions that held an entire civilization together. Victory against impossible odds should have marked the beginning of Ragnar's golden age, but history has a cruel sense of irony. Just 3 days after the siege ended, as the Iron Hall's defenders celebrated their unprecedented triumph, a Frankish crossbow bolt found its mark during what should have been a routine cleanup operation. The bolt itself was unremarkable standard military issue from some forgotten battlefield, salvaged by retreating enemies, and left behind as a final act of spite. But the tip had been treated with something the Vikings had no words for, a slow-acting poison that the Franks had learned to brew from battlefield physicians who'd studied too many dying enemies. Within hours, Ragnar was burning with fever, his magnificent hands, the same hands that had sketched impossible buildings on birch bark and guided revolutionary construction techniques, trembling as his life leaked away drop by poisoned drop. For 3 days he lingered, and those 3 days changed everything. Because Ragnar used his remaining time not to rage against fate or settle scores with enemies, but to sing. Hour after hour, he chanted the building songs that encoded his construction secrets in memorable verse, transforming technical knowledge into poetry that could survive in human memory long after written plans crumbled into dust. Think about the genius of this approach. In a largely pre-literate society where technical knowledge traditionally passed from master to apprentice through years of hands-on training, Ragnar created something unprecedented, a comprehensive construction manual disguised as entertainment. The songs contained everything: timber selection techniques hidden in verses about choosing faithful lovers, foundation principles embedded in stories about deep friendships, defensive mechanisms encoded in tales of family protection. Master builders from Uppsala to Dublin arrived as news spread of both the siege victory and Ragnar's condition. They expected to find jealously guarded secrets, trade knowledge locked away like treasure in some impregnable vault. Instead, they discovered Ragnar's daughter Thorun, barely 16 years old but already displaying her father's revolutionary vision, ready to teach anyone who swore a single oath to build for protection, not profit alone. The Hearthstone Guild she established became something unique in Viking Age history, a technical organization that transcended tribal boundaries and political allegiances. Guild members carried standardized techniques across vast distances, but they weren't just copying Ragnar's original design. Each new building adapted core principles to local conditions. Icelandic versions emphasized geothermal heating. Kiev variants incorporated Slavic woodworking traditions. Dublin halls blended Norse engineering with Celtic stonework. The economic revolution proved equally lasting and far more significant than anyone initially understood. When permanent, defensible settlements made trading consistently more profitable than raiding, the fundamental calculations that drove Viking expansion began to shift. Why risk everything on a single raid when secure warehouses and protected workshops could generate steady wealth for generations? This wasn't just an architectural change, it was the beginning of the transformation that would eventually turn Viking raiders into Viking traders, the same people who had terrorized European coastlines into the merchants and explorers who would establish trade routes reaching from Greenland to Constantinople. By 900 years after Christ, barely 50 years after Ragnar's death, modified Ragnar-style longhouses stretched from Iceland's volcanic shores to Kiev's river bluffs. Archaeological evidence suggests that variations of his techniques influenced construction as far south as Norman Sicily and as far west as the Father. Lance aux Meadows settlement in what would eventually become Canada. But the most fascinating legacy hides in plain sight, woven so deeply into subsequent architectural traditions that modern scholars are only beginning to recognize its scope. In modern Trondheim, tourists photograph a medieval stave church without realizing its structural bones follow principles. Ragnar developed 8 centuries earlier, overlapping planks for flexibility, concealed reinforcement for strength, defensive heights disguised as decoration. Archaeological teams studying unusually sophisticated Viking Age foundations unknowingly map the Hearthstone Guild's work throughout Scandinavia. Ground-penetrating radar reveals hidden chambers and defensive passages in structures that conventional history dismisses as simple farmsteads. Carbon dating confirms that advanced construction techniques appeared simultaneously across vast geographic areas during the late 9th century, spreading far too rapidly to represent independent invention. Most poignant are the building songs themselves, preserved in Norwegian folk tradition like DNA encoding information that later generations no longer understood but somehow knew they needed to protect. These songs survived the conversion to Christianity, the medieval period's architectural revolutions, even the industrial age's transformation of construction techniques. Modern Norwegian craftsmen still sing them during traditional building projects, their lyrics about love and loss and family protection hiding construction wisdom in verses that speak of choosing strong foundations like choosing faithful partners, of building walls that bend but don't break, like raising children who can weather life's storms, of creating spaces where communities can thrive through the darkest winters, like nurturing relationships that survive the hardest times. The singers forgot their song's original purpose, but they remembered their haunting melodies and their strangely specific details about timber and stone, about angles and stress points, about creating structures that protect what matters most against whatever forces threaten to tear it down. Standing today among the ruins of what archaeologists label simply as an advanced 9th century fortification, you can still trace the outline of Ragnar's impossible dream. The stone-filled walls remain, their thermal mass still moderating temperature fluctuations 9 centuries after their construction. The counterweight chambers are filled with debris now, but their engineering remains sound enough that restoration would be theoretically possible with modern equipment. And sometimes, if you listen carefully during the long northern nights, when wind moves through the ancient foundations, you can almost hear echoes of the building songs that transformed one bastard's vision of protection into an architectural revolution that changed the course of an entire civilization. The Iron Hall fell, eventually, of course. Not to enemies or fire or the simple passage of time, but to progress itself as Ragnar's innovations spread and improved. The original became just one example among many, its pioneering techniques absorbed into a tradition that grew far beyond what any single builder could have imagined. But the questions his life posed remain as relevant today as they were 12 centuries ago. How do we build communities that can survive whatever threatens them? How do we create structures that protect without isolating, that defend without destroying, that last not just through individual lifetimes, but across generations of change and challenge? In our age of global uncertainty and rapid change, when traditional institutions seem as fragile as wooden halls facing wildfire, perhaps it's time to remember what a bastard named Ragnar understood in the ashes of his grandmother's home: that the strongest defenses are built not through walls that exclude, but through communities that include, not through rigid resistance to change, but through flexible adaptation that bends without breaking. The building songs are still there, waiting in folk melodies and half-remembered verses, ready to teach anyone willing to listen how to construct something that has always been humanity's greatest need, a place where people can be safe together, whatever storms may come.